Do we need libertarian free will in order to think rationally? Is determinism somehow self-defeating? And if so, then does this provide us with some reason to think that God exists? There are certainly some theists who think so. While there are glimmers of such an argument to this end found throughout the apologetic literature, and while some philosophers, like Robert Locke and Jim Slagle, have offered sophisticated defenses of such an argument, within the online sphere of apologetics, an apologist by the name of Tim Stratton has probably become the most well-known defender of this sort of argument for libertarian free will and for theism. So greatly attached is Stratton to this argument that he has literally named his ministry after it. He calls his version of it the Freethinking argument. The basic idea is that one needs libertarian free will in order to be rational. Libertarian free will implies the existence of an immaterial soul, and an immaterial soul is best explained by the existence of God. Now, my doing an entire video on Stratton's argument is a little anomalous for this channel. I typically prefer to address arguments which are rigorously defended in the literature and which are taken seriously by skeptics. Stratton's argument, from what I have seen, meets neither of these conditions. However, Stratton is popular online, and his argument has become increasingly accepted among online Christian apologists. And since I know that online Christian apologists make up a sizable percentage of my audience, and because this series of videos on apologetic arguments which I don't use is intended to improve the quality of online Christian apologetics, I will address some issues which I have with Stratton's argument in this video. This is not intended to be a thorough critique of Stratton or his book. Other philosophers who specialize in the area of free will, notably Guillaume Bignon, Colton Carlson, and Jonathan Thompson, have already offered several incisive critiques of Stratton's entire approach to this issue. But this video will be exclusively focused upon Stratton's free-thinking argument as defended in the original edition of his 2020 book, Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. I should also be transparent up front that Stratton and myself have a little bit of history of rather strongly disagreeing with one another over this argument online. I consider Stratton to be a friend, but I have made no secret about the fact that I do not think that he comes anywhere close to making an adequate defense of this argument. However, I am not here interested in pursuing any of the drama resulting from our squabbles online. I am strictly concerned with the truth of certain premises within this argument and the defenses which he offers for them. Tim Stratton defends the free-thinking argument in the 12th chapter of his book. He formulates his argument into a variety of deductive syllogisms. The first version he offers, which he designates the free-thinking argument against naturalism, runs like this. 1. If naturalism is true, human nature does not include an immaterial soul. 2. If human nature does not include an immaterial soul, then humans do not possess libertarian freedom. 3. If humans do not possess libertarian freedom, then humans do not possess the ability to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. 4. Humans do possess the ability to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. 5. Therefore, humans possess libertarian freedom. 6. Therefore, human nature includes an immaterial soul. 7. Therefore, naturalism is false. Now, when philosophers make an argument of this sort, it is common for them to proceed to very clearly define their terms in such a way that it becomes more clear to the reader how they are getting to their conclusion. Unfortunately, as we shall see, Stratton doesn't offer much in the way of precise definitions of the terms which he is using in this argument. He does define what he means by libertarian freedom, at least, saying, "The version of libertarianism adopted here affirms that an agent possesses libertarian freedom if and only if the agent performs, has performed, or can perform a free action. This implies that a person possesses libertarian freedom if he, at some time, is not causally determined to do what he chooses and or has the ability to genuinely choose from among a range of alternative options, each of which is consistent and compatible with his nature." I am happy enough with this definition of libertarian freedom for the purposes of this video. Unfortunately, however, because Stratton does not explain how he is using most of the other terms in this argument, it's more difficult to interpret several parts of his argument. For example, his first premise states that if naturalism is true, human nature does not include an immaterial soul. Stratton seems to think that this premise is true by definition. All he says in defense of it is, premise 1 is synonymous with, if naturalism is true, then nature is all that exists. But are these really synonyms? Is saying nature is all that exists the same as saying that human beings do not have immaterial souls? Well, it depends upon what one means by nature. Unfortunately, Stratton never defines this term for us, so we are left to speculate as to what he might mean. Certainly plenty of naturalists do believe that people possess an immaterial soul, or at least that the mind possesses immaterial properties. So, as stated, Stratton's first premise is not exactly uncontroversial. Whether it is true by definition, as he seems to think, is entirely dependent upon whether or not one thinks that immaterial entities like souls can be natural entities. As Jonathan Thompson points out, admittedly, it is often conceded in the literature that immaterial minds would be too similar to God to be plausibly construed as purely natural entities. Notwithstanding, there are philosophical naturalists who make no such concession. For example, Josue Gusmo Rodriguez is a naturalist and yet is a substance dualist. Similarly, Helen Yetter Chappell is both a naturalist and an idealist. So Stratton owes us some type of argument for why he thinks the likeness that dualism shares with theism precludes naturalism simpliciter. Sadly, no such argument is ever offered or even remotely alluded to in either his book or his 2022 article. Presumably, Stratton is conflating naturalism, the idea that only natural entities exist, with materialism, the idea that only material entities exist. Now, it is easy to modify his argument accordingly by replacing naturalism with materialism. This modification does make the first premise true by definition, but it also renders the conclusion of the argument much less potent. Instead of functioning as an argument against naturalism, Stratton's argument becomes an argument against materialism, which is held by far fewer philosophers than is naturalism. Perhaps some viewers think that I am being uncharitable and pedantic here, but I think that if I am right about Stratton conflating naturalism and materialism, then this deserves to be highlighted. This is because Stratton takes himself to be offering an argument against naturalism. Yet his failure to understand how broad the naturalist camp actually is calls into question Stratton's competency with respect to arguing against naturalism. I do not think that Stratton offers an adequate defense of his second premise either, but since I actually agree with this premise for completely different reasons than the ones he offers, I will grant it for the sake of moving on to what I see as being the cornerstone premise of his argument, premise 3. This premise states that if humans do not possess libertarian freedom, then humans do not possess the ability to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. Now, knowledge can roughly be defined as justified true belief. I realize that this definition has become controversial due to the Gettier problem. I have explained in detail in another video why I don't believe that the Gettier problem actually challenges this analysis of knowledge. But more fundamentally, later in his book, Stratton himself accepts this analysis of knowledge, saying, epistemologists often define knowledge in the simplest terms as justified true belief. So this analysis will suffice for our purposes here. As to why Stratton feels the need to clutter his third premise by drawing a distinction between inferring and affirming knowledge claims, I do not know. First, why must this be with reference to knowledge claims in particular, as opposed to just knowledge? Does Stratton think that given determinism, we can affirm knowledge, but not knowledge claims? This seems doubtful. What is the difference even supposed to be? Second, why specify that given determinism, we both cannot rationally infer or rationally affirm knowledge claims? If one cannot rationally affirm knowledge claims, then it trivially follows that they cannot rationally infer knowledge claims either. What is an inference if not an affirmation of a conclusion from some prior set of premises? This is just a needless redundancy within the premise as far as I can see. Perhaps Stratton is just a redundant writer, but I think it's more likely that he just hasn't thought very carefully about the wording of these premises, perhaps as a result of his failure to engage the literature surrounding these issues. Putting aside the fact that this third premise is needlessly cluttered and redundant, the basic proposition is at least intelligible. Stratton takes it that if determinism were true, then people could not have any rational justification for their beliefs. Libertarian freedom, in some sense, is necessary in order to have epistemic justification for one's beliefs. But why think that this is true? Well, Stratton has a lot to say in defense of this premise. He argues that if a person's thoughts and beliefs are forced upon him, and he could not have chosen better thoughts and beliefs, then he is simply left assuming that his determined thoughts and beliefs are good, and that his beliefs are true. But it clearly does not follow that one is left merely assuming the truth of their beliefs just because they were forced to hold them, for it remains logically possible for someone to be forced to hold a belief and to also be forced to have justification for that belief. As Robert Locke observes, in response to this argument, the most likely move for the determinist is to claim that her embrace of determinism is in some way both determined by antecedent conditions and by normative epistemic determinants. Claiming that a belief is unjustified merely because of the way in which it came about is a clear example of the genetic fallacy. Beliefs are justified or unjustified because of the reasons, or lack thereof, which support them, not because of how they came about. Again, Locke explains, the objection will be that it matters not how we came by our belief in determinism, it matters only that the belief is true, or the process by which we arrived at it is truth conducive. To get to the conclusion that one is left with bare assumptions, Stratton needs to specify within the hypothetical that the individual in question is both forced to hold a belief and that they are forced to do so without any grounds. But of course, if he does that, then the hypothetical no longer accurately describes what determinists believe. The central question for Stratton, then, is this: why is it that one cannot be determined to have a true belief, but cannot also be determined to have justification for that belief? As David Hodgson points out, one of the traditional arguments in favor of free will is to the effect that we cannot have reasonable grounds for believing determinism to be true, because if determinism were true, we would simply believe whatever we were caused to believe by deterministic processes which govern our beliefs, just as they govern everything else. One difficulty is that it assumes that reasonable grounds for belief cannot be deterministic, whereas it might be thought that our abilities to perceive accurately and to draw reasonable inferences depend for their reliability upon the processes which unfold regularly in accordance with the laws of nature and or rules of logic, that is, on processes that are deterministic. Thus, it can be argued determinism supports the reasonableness of our beliefs rather than the reverse. It certainly seems possible for someone to be determined to believe some propositions and for them to likewise be determined to be aware of various facts which support the truth of the proposition. Imagine two parallel worlds, World A and World B. In both worlds, suppose that a fellow named John believes the exact same proposition on the basis of the exact same evidence. Moreover, in both worlds, that proposition is true. In World A, John used his libertarian free will to believe the proposition. In World B, John was determined to believe the proposition. I take it that no one disagrees that John knows the proposition in World A, but since John is in exactly the same position in World B, the only difference lying in the explanation for why he got there, upon what basis could one say that John does not know or rationally believe the same proposition in World B? It seems like if John's belief, John's evidence, and the truth value of that belief all remain exactly the same, then regardless of why it is that he came to believe the proposition, he should still know it to be true. It appears that Stratton sees something justificatory about how John comes to hold this belief. I am curious what this might be. How does the process by which John comes into possession of his belief affect the justificatory status of that belief? If John's evidence is the same, regardless of how he came to possess it, then it seems that the belief should be justified no matter what. The only way around this, so it seems to me, is to deny that evidence can justify beliefs all on its own. Now, I once publicly issued this challenge to Stratton. Here is what he said in response. The beliefs of John A and John B are not merely based upon the same evidence. The beliefs of John A are based upon the fact that he has been intelligently designed and finely tuned with cognitive faculties with the power to infer best explanations about ultimate reality if he carefully evaluates the evidence. The beliefs of John B, on the other hand, are fully explained and based upon the whims of a deity of deception who determines all of his followers, including John B, to experience sensations of evaluating evidence in such a way that ultimately determines him to get important things wrong about metaphysics and theology. Thus, John A and John B do not stand on the same epistemological foundation. Now, there are two possible ways to interpret this reply to the thought experiment. On the one hand, Stratton could be maintaining that world B is just logically impossible. That is to say, there is some logical contradiction involved in the idea that John is determined to believe a true proposition on the basis of the same evidence as John in world A. But that is surely not obviously the case. If Stratton takes it that world B entails a logical contradiction, then the onus is on him to demonstrate that contradiction. The other way to interpret this reply is that Stratton might take it that evidence is insufficient to justify a proposition. If so, then John's belief in world B will not be justified even if it is based on the same evidence as in world A. If so, then Stratton is adopting a very odd position indeed. Certainly there are philosophers who maintain that there are other ways in addition to evidence for beliefs to be justified, but hardly anyone maintains that evidence is not a means of justification at all. If that is Stratton's position, then I hope he can produce some very strong arguments to support it. Perhaps Stratton does not intend to say that evidence is not a means of justification at all, but rather that evidence is not an autonomous means of justification. That is, Stratton might think that something else is needed in addition to evidence in order for a belief to be justified, and presumably, for Stratton, whatever else is required will include libertarian freedom, but this assumes the falsity of evidentialism. Again, Stratton is merely asserting that more is required for epistemic justification than adequate evidence. He is just asserting that John's belief in world B is not justified because it doesn't include libertarian freedom, but that appears to be question-begging. The original challenge presents two scenarios where John is in exactly the same evidential position and asks why his belief is unjustified in the deterministic world. To answer by saying, because the world is deterministic, is a question-begging response. In passing, I should also note that there is good reason for thinking that the theist who affirms God's necessary omniscience cannot maintain that the ability to do or believe otherwise is actually necessary for knowledge or for justified beliefs. Presumably the theist wants to maintain that God himself cannot believe other than he does for the simple fact that all of God's beliefs must be true. But if all of God's beliefs must be true, then it is not possible for God to believe otherwise. Yet surely God's beliefs must be justified, for otherwise they would not be known. Therefore it seems that Stratton cannot maintain that the ability to believe otherwise is a necessary condition for epistemic justification without creating serious problems for the doctrine of omniscience. As Bignon explains, if God's beliefs necessarily correspond to reality, as they must since God is essentially omniscient, then Stratton cannot analyze God's ability to think otherwise in categorical or modal terms, or he would have possible worlds wherein God holds false beliefs, where the truth is P, but God exercised his categorical ability to freely believe not P, which is absurd. Stratton is unclear with respect to whether he intends for his argument to apply exclusively to inferential beliefs, or whether he intends for his argument to apply to all beliefs, regardless of where they end up within one's knowledge structure. He sometimes speaks as though he thinks that his argument applies to all beliefs, such as when he says, "This, then, is the paramount concern for the atheistic naturalist who affirms exhaustive determinism. If determinism is true, then atheists, or anyone else for that matter, cannot possess justification for their beliefs. To make matters worse, if justification is required for knowledge, then knowledge becomes illusory. He adds no qualifiers here, so it appears as though he intends for his statement to encompass all forms of knowledge. Yet other times, he seems to think that his argument only applies to inferential knowledge, saying that one could never rationally affirm or argue that his beliefs are the inference to the best explanation, and that, if exhaustive determinism is true, then no one can possess inferential knowledge. Statements like these suggest that Stratton's argument only applies to inferential knowledge. It's unclear if Stratton intends to restrict the scope of his argument in this way because he simply never specifies. Guillaume Bignon laments, as we now consider Stratton's claim that determinism would prevent humans from making reasonable knowledge claims, we first want to know what kind of knowledge he's talking about. Is he arguing that determinism undermines the rationality of every knowledge claim, or only some subset of them? I do think he intends to restrict the scope of his argument to something like knowledge obtained by drawing inferences to the best explanation, but his own words on the matter are very inconsistent. But in any case, what reason is there for thinking that determinism precludes inferential knowledge? Stratton claims that, if a person cannot freely infer the best explanation from within a range of multiple possible competing explanations, then he has no justification that his belief really is the best explanation. But why should we think that being determined to infer to the best explanation precludes having justification for that inference? An inference to the best explanation is deemed to be such because it fulfills certain criteria, which is also not contingent upon a person's judgment, such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, degree of ad hocness, etc. The pertinent question regards whether a putative inference to the best explanation actually fulfills that criteria. As Hamid Vahid points out, on any plausible account of epistemic justification, there must be an intimate link between truth and justification. Given the satisfaction of the conditions of justification, it is highly probable that the pertinent beliefs are true. So a justified belief is a belief that is more likely to be true. Is Stratton suggesting that one cannot be aware that an inference fulfills these criteria if determinism is true? And if one cannot, why not? Stratton owes us an explanation for why this should not be possible, and yet he never offers one. Stratton appears to be shifting the justifying factor for any particular belief from the evidence which supports its truth to the abilities of the believer, but he has not motivated this shift. He has not provided us with any reason to think that evidence alone is insufficient for a belief to be justified. Again, David Hodgson points out, the other difficulty is that the argument is purely negative. It doesn't give any positive reason to believe in free will. Certainly the argument doesn't explain how or why indeterminism or free will could provide any sounder basis than determinism for reasonable belief. From my perspective, the value of evidence lies in the fact that it is not contingent upon any person's judgment. This makes it something objective and therefore something which could justify a belief. I don't see any reason why I should think that having libertarian free will is also a necessary condition for justification. Stratton does absolutely no legwork to show any deficiencies in hardline evidentialism, nor does he explain how adding libertarian free will to our concept of justification overcomes such deficiencies. He's really just assuming that libertarian free will is necessary for epistemic justification. But that is the very proposition which the skeptic of the argument wants him to justify. For all his complaints about determinists begging the question in favor of their beliefs, one could be forgiven for suggesting that Stratton is doing the very same thing, and merely begging the question with respect to the idea that libertarian free will is necessary for epistemic justification. What is the argument for that conclusion? As Colton Carlson observes, the problem is that Stratton accuses determinists of question-begging or circular reasoning when it is not their argument under the present consideration within that chapter. It is Stratton's. It is simply not their turn to positively argue for their position. It is Stratton's chapter and Stratton's arguments, along with Stratton's defenses of those same arguments. So if anyone could be charged with circular reasoning, I am afraid it cannot be the proponent of a view in which an argument is not even considered. The only one that could be accused of question begging during Stratton's chapter for libertarian freedom is Stratton himself, for he is the only one holding the key to the burden of proof. From my perspective, inferential justification depends on a subject being aware of the premises which support his beliefs, as well as all the validity relations which allow the belief to be inferred from those premises. It seems to me that one can weigh options X and options Y, see that option X has more evidence than option Y, believe option X on the basis of those reasons, and therefore be rational, even if he could not have believed Y. This is because I view rationality as being contingent upon the truth of the premises and the validity of the inference being drawn, not the ability of the subject to do otherwise. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew explain, if a proposition is highly probable on the basis of one's evidence, it is rational on the basis of that evidence to accept that proposition as true. Inferential relations which convey rational confidence are therefore intrinsically truth-directed, i.e., aimed towards truth, since they tell us when and how inference permits a subject rationally to believe a proposition. On this account, validity of inference based upon justified premises is a sufficient condition for inferential epistemic justification. One can be determined to be aware of these reasons which support his beliefs, even under determinism. So from my perspective, I have a perfectly satisfactory account of inferential justification, which makes no reference to libertarian free will and comports with determinism. Stratton comes along saying that actually this account is not sufficient and we need libertarian freedom in order to have inferential justification. My question is, why should I abandon what seems to me to be a perfectly cogent account of inferential justification for what Stratton is offering? At this point in a philosophical dialectic, it would be customary for Stratton to highlight some sort of putative shortcoming or problem in my account, and then show how adding libertarian free will to our theory of inferential justification overcomes that problem. In theory, this would motivate me to abandon what I had previously seen as a viable account, and to accept his account instead. Alternatively, he could agree that my account of inferential justification is viable, but then argue that it is not actually compatible with determinism. Perhaps he could try to argue that there is some sort of logical contradiction involved in saying that one could be determined to be aware of the reasons which support their beliefs. But he just never does any of this, and based upon repeated interactions with him over the issue, he seems incapable of doing so. Perhaps Stratton could attempt to argue that we cannot know which of our beliefs are rational, since, under determinism, we do not control which inference is made. However, because evidence is something of which we are directly aware, we can trace the justification, or lack thereof, for our inferential beliefs right down to their foundation, even if we are determined to do so. If we weren't aware of the relevant facts, inferences, and relations, then we would simply not possess evidence. In that case, the resulting absence of justification owes to a lack of evidence, and not to the fact that the inference was determined. The fact of the matter is that, for the evidentialist, justification is all about believing in accordance with the reasons available to the subject, and as long as these reasons can remain accessible to the subject given determinism, evidentialist epistemic justification survives even on determinism. A further concern which I have about Stratton's defense of his third premise is that the argument he offers in support of it is a transcendental argument. Transcendental arguments are a particular species of deductive arguments. As Robert Stern explains, transcendental arguments are usually said to be distinctive in involving a certain sort of claim, namely that for Y to be possible, X must be the case, where Y is some indisputable fact about us or our mental life. These sorts of arguments can be divided into what are called modest transcendental arguments and ambitious transcendental arguments. Modest transcendental arguments merely attempt to show that we must believe some proposition in order to be consistent with some other proposition, but they stop short of claiming that the proposition which must be believed is actually true. whereas ambitious transcendental arguments try to take a further step and claim not merely that we must believe the proposition to be true, but also that it is actually true. Stratton's free thinking argument is a type of ambitious transcendental argument. My concern is that ambitious transcendental arguments principally cannot establish the truth of their conclusions. This means that even if my concerns voiced above can be given satisfactory answers, and it is true that rationality requires libertarian freedom, it would not follow that libertarian freedom actually exists. The only conclusion that would follow is that we must believe that we have libertarian freedom if we are going to believe that we are being rational. But that leaves the question open regarding whether or not we actually are rational, and therefore whether or not we actually are free in the libertarian sense. Being constrained to believe something is no proof that it is true. Now, in his main argument, Stratton does include a premise stating that humans have the ability to rationally infer knowledge, but his defense of this premise is likewise transcendental. He argues that one cannot deny it without affirming it, and while this is of course quite true, it is possible to be skeptical of it without affirming it. Moreover, it principally does not establish that humans actually can rationally infer knowledge claims. At best, it only establishes that we must believe that we can do this on pain of contradicting ourselves. He says that it is properly basic that some humans do possess the ability to make these evaluative and rational judgments. In fact, if one objects to this premise, he or she seems to actually be affirming the same premise. In other words, if there were a successful argument for global skepticism, this would imply that knowledge has been gained, and therefore that global skepticism is false. However, I am not convinced that skepticism can be so easily dismissed. For even though it is certainly true that no one could deny knowledge without making a knowledge claim, this does not mean that anyone actually knows anything at all. In other words, there is a distinction between the knowability of skepticism and the thesis of skepticism. As Barry Stroud says, if the set of beliefs we attribute to ourselves and others enjoy as a whole the kind of invulnerability I have identified, these allegedly skeptical possibilities can represent no threat to our beliefs. We should not find ourselves massively mistaken in the beliefs we can recognize ourselves as holding. Error of that cosmic scope is not something we could discover to be so, consistently with continuing to ascribe and to think of ourselves as possessing the beliefs in question. If there is a certain invulnerability against philosophical skepticism here, it does not amount to anything as strong as a denial of what skepticism says. Philosophical skepticism says that we do not know certain things that we think we know. To show that that is false would be to show that we do know those things. The kind of invulnerability I have in mind does not imply that we do know them. It does not imply that we know the things in question, and it does not imply that they are true. It does not imply that the beliefs in question are indispensable to any conception of an independent world. It does not even say that the beliefs in question are invulnerable in the sense that we could never or never reasonably give them up. What it implies about invulnerable beliefs is that we could never see ourselves as holding the beliefs in question and be mistaken. While it is quite true that no one could ever know that skepticism is true, this fact does not do anything to refute skepticism as such. It could still be true that no one possessed any knowledge at all, even if no one could know that this was the case. Indeed, if skepticism were true, then we would not expect anyone to know it. But this fact hardly provides evidence against the possible truth of skepticism. Thus, the mere fact that no one can claim to know that skepticism is true is not damaging to the skeptical thesis. The bottom line is that skepticism is not inherently self-refuting, even if a claim to know it is epistemically self-defeating. Hence, a refutation of skepticism is still required to justify Stratton's fourth premise. Showing that skepticism cannot be justifiably believed is insufficient to show that skepticism is false. And here we reach the crux of the problem with Stratton's transcendental argument. If Stratton refutes skepticism, then he will have done so by proving the reality of knowledge. But if this is accomplished, then it seems that libertarian freedom is not needed for knowledge. Perhaps Stratton could refute skepticism by proving knowledge of libertarian freedom, but this seems unlikely since his argument for libertarian freedom requires the reality of knowledge to already be established in premise 4, and therefore the reality of knowledge cannot be used to refute skepticism. Perhaps he could prove knowledge of libertarian freedom through another argument, but in that case, the free-thinking argument becomes unnecessary since libertarian freedom could be established without it. None of these options end in Stratton's favor as far as I can see. I have now detailed at some length why I believe that the third premise of the argument is, at the very least, unjustified and probably false. That project was largely defensive, intended to show that Stratton has not done the work necessary to justify the key premise of his argument. But now I want to switch gears and take the offensive against his argument by arguing that there is a fundamental inconsistency between the third and fourth premises of his argument, such that if the third premise is true, then the fourth premise is false, and conversely, if the fourth premise is true, then the third premise is false. It is important to emphasize that throughout this next section, I will not be challenging the truth of the fourth premise of the argument. As I have already pointed out, I reject the third premise of the argument. I am merely trying to point out that if someone affirms the third premise, then they cannot simultaneously affirm the fourth premise. In other words, the third and fourth premise are in conflict with one another. My argument runs as follows. 1. If one cannot be epistemically justified in believing that the necessary conditions for epistemic justification obtain, then one cannot rationally believe that any of their beliefs are epistemically justified. 2. Epistemic justification can be either probabilistic, inferential, or certain. 3. If libertarian free will is a necessary condition for epistemic justification, then the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be justified probabilistically or inferentially. 4. The belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be justified with certainty. 5. Libertarian free will is a necessary condition for epistemic justification. 6. Therefore, the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be epistemically justified. 7. Therefore, one cannot be epistemically justified in believing that any of their beliefs are epistemically justified. Now, obviously, I am going to escape the conclusion of this argument by rejecting the fifth premise. But presumably the defender of the free-thinking argument wants to maintain premise 5, as it is nearly identical to Stratton's premise 3, for otherwise they have to reject the free-thinking argument. However, why should the defender of the free-thinking argument accept the other premises of this argument? Well, the first premise shouldn't be too controversial. After all, justified beliefs depend upon the necessary conditions for epistemic justification being met. For example, if you believe that Berlin is the capital of Germany, a necessary condition for this belief to be justified is that you are justified in believing that there is such a place as Germany in the first place. You could not possibly be justified in believing the proposition that Berlin is the capital of Germany if you were not already justified in believing the proposition that Germany exists. So similarly, if libertarian free will is a necessary condition for justifiably believing any other proposition, as Tim Stratton wants to maintain, then we would have to be justified in believing that libertarian free will obtains before we could be justified in believing anything else. If this is right, then we have to be justified in believing in libertarian free will before we can justifiably believe in literally any other proposition. For if we believe some other proposition without first having justification for believing in libertarian freedom, then it might turn out that there is no libertarian freedom after all, and that, consequently, the original belief is unjustified. So the proponent of Stratton's argument seems to be committed to accepting the first premise of my argument. The second premise should also be fairly uncontroversial. If some belief is epistemically justified, then this just means that there is some reason which is either guaranteeing that the belief is true, or at least making it more probably true than not. That's just what epistemic justification means. If a proposition is not certainly true, and not even probably true, then it is just not justified. So the second premise is true by definition. The third premise is where things begin to get interesting. The third premise asserts that if libertarian free will is a necessary condition for epistemic justification, then the belief that libertarian free will obtains cannot be justified probabilistically. To see why this is so, consider what probabilistic justification consists in. To say that a proposition is probably true is to say that other justifiably believed propositions render it more likely true than false. Probabilities are always relative to something else. Some other justifiably believed propositions have to be making it more probably true than false. A proposition cannot be probably true all on its own, nor can it be probably true relative to unjustified propositions, for then there would be no justification to transmit. Some further propositions must be justifiably believed in order to tip the scales in favor of truth. As Timothy McGrew argues, to what body of evidence are epistemically probable claims related then? The natural answer is that, under all ordinary circumstances, they are related to our ostensible background knowledge, a set of beliefs which we take to be more or less unproblematic. This raises in an obvious, though informal way, the insufficiency of moderate foundationalism. When the stock of relatively unproblematic beliefs is exhausted by the regress, there is nothing left to confer high epistemic probability on the basic beliefs. Hence, any version of foundationalism that appeals to the high epistemic probability of its basic beliefs is doomed from the outset. Epistemic probability cannot accrue from nothing. Here is where we run into the major problem for Stratton. Any further beliefs to which one might appeal in order to render their belief that libertarian free will obtains probable will themselves need to be justified. However, given premises 1 and 5, those supporting beliefs cannot themselves be justified until one has already justified their belief that libertarian free will obtains. Remember, given premise 1 and premise 5, libertarian free will is necessary for epistemic justification. Together, these premises entail that one must justifiably believe that they have libertarian free will before they can justifiably believe anything else. Hence, there is no possibility of using other beliefs to justify this belief that libertarian freedom obtains. No arguments can be constructed for the reality of libertarian freedom without begging the question. If libertarian freedom is a precondition for any justified beliefs, then all argumentation would assume libertarian freedom for the start, because all argumentation presupposes justified beliefs. Consequently, the third premise is true. There is no inferential way to justify the belief that libertarian free will obtains if libertarian free will is indeed necessary for the possibility of justified beliefs. But what about the fourth premise? Perhaps the defender of Stratton's argument would want to maintain that we can't actually know that libertarian free will obtains apart from any intervening arguments, but can instead know it directly and with certainty. This doesn't strike me as a very promising or plausible move. Even most believers in libertarian free will want to maintain that it is at least epistemically possible that determinism is true. For example, while alluding to this very sort of free-thinking argument, William Lane Craig acknowledges that determinism is epistemically possible, saying, "Determinism could be true, but it's very hard to see how it could ever be rationally affirmed." No one, to my knowledge, argues that we have some sort of logical proof against determinism or decisive evidence for libertarian free will. And if the defender of Stratton's argument wants to maintain that libertarian free will is known non-inferentially and with certainty, then the free-thinking argument becomes superfluous and pointless, since they would already know with certainty that they have libertarian freedom without this argument. Hence, in order to rescue the free-thinking argument from my argument in this way, the proponent of the free-thinking argument will no longer be able to base his belief in libertarian freedom on the free-thinking argument. But for anyone who does not take themselves to have absolute certainty that libertarian free will obtains, the fourth premise of my argument should be accepted as true. As we have already seen, The defender of the free-thinking argument should want to affirm the fifth premise, since it merely states the principle which undergirds the third premise of Stratton's argument. The sixth premise just states the logical entailment of premises 3 through 6, and the seventh premise is just the logical entailment of premises 1, 5, and 6. Unfortunately, however, the conclusion of this argument negates the fourth premise of Stratton's argument. The only plausible way out of my argument is to deny the fifth premise, which requires one to deny Stratton's third premise. Conversely, if one affirms Stratton's third premise, this appears to commit them to the conclusion of my argument, which will require them to reject Stratton's fourth premise. In short, if one affirms premise 3 of Stratton's argument, then they have to deny premise 4. If one affirms premise 4, as I do, then one has to deny premise 3, as I do. Ironically then, if one wants to preserve epistemic justification, then they have to deny the key premise of the free-thinking argument. This video has covered Tim Stratton's free-thinking argument against naturalism. I have expressed concerns about the wording of the first premise, but concluded that these can be overcome by sufficiently modifying the first premise. I have argued that the third premise is unjustified and probably false given a plausible evidentialist account of epistemic justification, which Stratton gives no reasons whatsoever to regard as insufficient. I have expressed concerns regarding the inability of the argument to actually tell us anything about the world due to its ambitious transcendental nature. And finally, I have argued that there is an irreconcilable tension between the third and fourth premises of Stratton's argument, such that one cannot affirm one premise without denying the other. These objections, both individually and collectively, are why I do not use the free-thinking argument when making my own case for theism.